spring of 1981, tensions between Iran and the United States threatened to boil over into major theater war. An international crisis in which 52 Americans were held captive by Islamic revolutionaries in Tehran just ended. For 444 days, Iranians controlled the U.S. Embassy. The catastrophe finally ended in January 1981 with the release of all hostages. Images of Americans at the mercy of Iranian college students still haunted the American psyche. President Reagan was concerned the Islamic Revolution would further engulf Iran. A major concern, Ayatollah Khomeini might prevent the free flow of oil in the Persian Gulf. Still shaken by the stunning 1979 Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the U.S. Department of Defense was also concerned about a Soviet move on Iran.
Well, you have to look at the context, which was amidst the Cold War, and there was the very real possibility of a global war against the Soviet Union. And there was a recognition that if the Soviets could take Middle East oil, it represented an Achilles heel for the West. It's 2/3 of all the proven oil reserves at the time stemmed from the Middle East.
Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger realized the boundary between two massive four-star commands, European Command and Pacific Command, ran through the most volatile region in the world, the Middle East.
Prior to the formation of CENTCOM, a number of commands came and went that had a supplementary focus on the Middle East. These are all headquartered in MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa, Florida, and they all had a focus on deploying rapidly anywhere in the world. The final such command was formed in 1980. This is the Rapid Deployment Joint Task Force, or the RDJTF, RJTF. RJTF was a command under a 3-star general with a responsibility for quickly moving a large force overseas to any contingency in the world. The RJTF also had responsibility to plan to respond to a crisis in the Persian Gulf or Iran.
To ensure a single command would lead American efforts in the event of a war in the Persian Gulf, Weinberger approved the formation of a new command, U.S. Central Command, or CENTCOM. The new combatant command would be headquartered at MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa, Florida. CENTCOM's command area would span 19 countries, from Egypt in the west to Pakistan in the east to Kenya in the south. President Reagan and Secretary Weinberger selected Army General Robert Kingston as the first commander of U.S. Central Command. Kingston, who'd led the Rapid Deployment Joint Task Force in 1981, had coincidentally been the man who recommended the name U.S. Central Command for the new organization. Known as Barbed Wire Bob, Kingston was a proven warfighter who'd led troops through some of the most violent moments of the Korean War and led covert operations in Vietnam where he'd earned the Distinguished Service Cross. Kingston knew readiness. He knew the threat posed by Iran. He knew how to mobilize large forces. So on January 1st, 1983, the United States had a new command. CENTCOM was born.
U.S. Central Command was born out of concern that the rising Islamic Revolution in Iran might spill over into the Persian Gulf, a major throughway for global energy. In the early 1980s, this terrifying scenario became real, testing CENTCOM's ability to guide combat forces for the first time. At the end of the 1970s, the Iranian Revolution inflamed already rising tensions with Iraq, Iran's neighbor to the west. In September 1980, a long history of border disputes between the two regional powers came to a head. Iraq invaded Iran. The Iraqi army performed well at first and looked to secure an early victory over Iran. However, Iranian defenses held the fighting ground to a violent stalemate. By 1982, the war's momentum shifted decisively in favor of Iran. The Iran-Iraq War lasted most of the 1980s and became one of the bloodiest conflicts of the late 20th century. Casualties for both armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands. At first, the war was fought exclusively on land.
At the start of the war, both sides agreed to keep the sea lanes open. They essentially agreed to allow global commerce to flow through the Persian Gulf without interference.
This changed in 1984, With the ground war at a stalemate, Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein increased the tax on Iranian oil exports at sea. Iran retaliated. A new phase of the fighting emerged, the tanker war.
In 1986, things get even more serious. Iran announces a full blockade of military cargo headed for Iraq and starts challenging ships headed for the Strait of Hormuz. Shortly thereafter, the Iranian Navy stopped an American cargo ship in international waters near the Persian Gulf. No one was hurt, the ship was eventually released, but it was a very embarrassing incident for the United States. At this point, the American administration is drawn into the tanker war.
On May 17, 1987, it became clear just how dangerous the Persian Gulf had become. An Iraqi fighter jet fired 2 missiles at the USS Stark, a U.S. Navy missile frigate supporting CENTCOM. The strike killed 37 sailors and injured 21. Iraqi officials said the targeting of the U.S. warship was accidental. To protect the free flow of Kuwaiti oil through the Persian Gulf, in July 1987, CENTCOM launched Operation Earnest Will, the largest naval convoy operation since World War II.
It's largely forgotten to history, but the U.S. was engaged in a 14-month low-grade war with Iran at sea during Operation Earnest Will. Almost immediately into the convoy mission, an American tanker hit Iranian naval mines.
In April 1988, CENTCOM sent Iran a clear message that attacks on shipping vessels would not stand. CENTCOM struck Iranian surveillance facilities and naval ships with coordinated, pinpoint attacks. It was Operation Praying Mantis, a stunning display of American combat power. The Iran-Iraq War was devastating. It was one of the largest and longest conventional wars since the Korean War armistice came into effect in 1953. 500,000 lives were lost. Another million were injured. The economic cost of the Iran-Iraq War exceeded $1 trillion, and it marked the last time chemical weapons were used on a massive scale. Yet, in the end, very little had changed.
Despite all the drama, all the bloodshed, all the violence, the Iran-Iraq War resolved nothing in terms of the boundaries of the two countries. The battle lines barely moved. The war hopelessly ground to a stalemate, and both sides finally agreed to a ceasefire on August 20th, 1988. So, there was no resolution, no victory, only loss, only violence. But the war was so massive in scope, so stunning in its sweep, that it led to numerous aftershocks that rippled throughout the region. One of them arrived just 2 years later in Kuwait.
In August 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait in a bid to gain more control over the lucrative oil resources of the Middle East. Iraqi forces not only seized Kuwait, but established menacing positions along the Saudi-Kuwaiti border, posing a clear threat to the oil fields of Saudi Arabia. In response, the United States and the UN Security Council demanded that Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein withdraw Iraqi troops from Kuwait. Hussein refused. The defense of Saudi Arabia, called Operation Desert Shield, quickly became a multinational effort. Egypt, Syria, France, the United Kingdom, and others joined the coalition and began sending forces to Saudi Arabia in the summer of 1990. CENTCOM, led by U.S. Army General Norman Schwarzkopf, served as the overall theater headquarters for the campaign. On January 16, 1991, President George H.W. Bush announced the start of what would be called Operation Desert Storm, a military operation to expel occupying Iraqi forces from Kuwait. CENTCOM was about to go to war. Coalition forces began a 5-week bombardment of Iraqi command and control targets from air and sea. Schwarzkopf was concerned that Saddam Hussein might order the use of chemical weapons. A ground invasion began on February 24, with coalition forces swiftly driving into Iraq and Kuwait.
In Operation Desert Storm, CENTCOM forces had every advantage. Training, armament, leadership. Really what's just as important is the way that coalition commanders employed these advantages against the Iraqi army.
The plan for the ground campaign featured a broad coalition attack on Iraqi units in Kuwait that locked them into position. Iraqi forces were also preparing for an amphibious assault on Kuwait. At the same time, mobile armored forces enveloped the Iraqi army from the west by driving deep into southern Iraq, aiming for the Iraqi Republican Guard divisions. This maneuver proved to be the devastating blow that forced the Iraqi army out of Kuwait and into a headlong retreat northward back into Iraq.
Coalition forces decisively defeated a battle-hardened and dangerous enemy. And during air and ground operations, U.S. and Allied forces destroyed thousands of tanks, thousands of armored personnel carriers, artillery pieces.
A ceasefire was declared after 100 hours, controversially leaving Hussein in power. While coalition casualties were in the hundreds, Iraqi losses numbered in the tens of thousands.
It also validated the Army's investment in new military hardware in the 1980s, like the Abrams tank, the Patriot missile system. It really was a validation point for the Army's total force concept. This is an idea that had been in philosophy since the 1970s. This is the idea of using reserve forces to supplement, to complement active units, to help constitute and maintain an effective battlefield force. And the success in Desert Storm really did prove the total force army concept.
Desert Storm had come to a sudden and successful end. Saddam Hussein was beaten, his forces routed, but he remained in power. CENTCOM and coalition forces had written their first chapter on cooperation, harnessing technology, and determination against a formidable opponent. Meanwhile, new threats started to emerge, emboldened and embittered by the presence of Americans in the region.